You burned the letter.
I don't belong to Boston anymore.
You chose this ranch?
I chose you.
Then you're finally home.
Dust choked the wooden platform as the train hissed to a halt. Gail held a crumpled photograph of a man she'd never met and a marriage contract bearing her sister's name. One desperate lie was about to forge a dynasty in the Wyoming dirt or get her killed. The cowboy was waiting. History books rarely mention the women who tamed the American West with a lie. In the spring of 1878, the city of Boston was a place of suffocating rules and crushing debts for the Miller family. Gail Miller was 24, practical, dark-haired, and possessed hands calloused from taking in other people's sewing. Her younger sister Clara was the jewel of the family, 19, golden-haired, porcelain-skinned, and entirely vain. When their father passed away, he left them nothing but a mountain of promissory notes. The bank was threatening to seize their cramped boarding house. That was when Clara, seeking a wealthy savior, answered an advertisement in the matrimonial news. The ad was placed by a man named Jeremiah Caldwell, a rancher out in Bitter Creek, Wyoming territory. He didn't write with flowery poetry. His letters were written in a sharp, slanted hand, speaking of a sprawling ranch, a herd of cattle, and the need for a strong, loyal woman to help him build a legacy. He promised security. To prove his earnestness, he wired a dowry and travel fund of $400, a staggering fortune at the time. Clara took the money. She paid off the most aggressive debt collectors, bought 3 silk dresses for her grand journey, and complained endlessly about the prospect of living in the dirt. Gail, meanwhile, read Jeremiah's letters in the quiet of the night. Where Clara saw a brute, Gail saw a man of profound loneliness and honorable intent. He wrote of the violet sunsets over the Bighorn Mountains and the quiet peace of the open range. Gail fell in love with his words, even though they were meant for her sister. 2 days before the train was scheduled to depart for Cheyenne, Gail woke up to a chilling silence. Clara's bed was empty. Pinned to her sister's pillow was a hastily scribbled note. Clara had eloped with a silver-tongued traveling salesman named Phineas, taking the remaining $50 of Jeremiah's money with her. She wrote that she could never marry a filthy cattle herder and wished Gail luck with the boarding house. Gail sat on the edge of the bed, the paper trembling in her hands. The reality of their situation crashed down on her. The debts were only half paid. When Jeremiah Caldwell realized he had been swindled, he would send the law. The Pinkertons would trace the money, and Gail would be thrown in a debtor's prison for her sister's crime. There was only one way out. It was a mad, terrifying thought. But as Gail looked at the train ticket sitting on the dresser, her resolve hardened. Jeremiah Caldwell needed a wife. He had paid for a bride. He was going to get one. She packed her few woolen dresses, a sturdy pair of boots, and the letters. She didn't look like the miniature portrait Clara had sent him, a painted ivory cameo of a golden-haired angel. Gail was plain, her features sharp, her hair the color of roasted chestnuts, but she had grit. The transcontinental train journey was a grueling, 7-day nightmare of soot, rattling cars, and changing landscapes. As the train left behind the green hills of the east and pushed into the vast, dry ocean of the Great Plains, Gail's terror mounted. Every clack of the iron wheels sounded like a judge's gavel. Liar, 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 liar. She rehearsed her story 100 times. She would tell him she was Clara. If he questioned her appearance, she would blame a severe fever that darkened her hair, or say the portrait artist had taken liberties. She would work her fingers to the bone to earn the $400, and if he ever found out the truth, she hoped she would have made herself too indispensable to be cast out. When the locomotive finally groaned into the dusty, wind-battered depot of Bitter Creek, Wyoming, the sheer emptiness of the land stole the breath from Gail's lungs. There were no paved streets, just a few wooden storefronts, a saloon, a livery, and an endless expanse of sagebrush under a bruised gray sky. She stepped off the train, the wind immediately tearing at her hat, and there, standing by a weathered buckboard wagon, was Jeremiah Caldwell. He was not the man Gail had pictured. The letters suggested a quiet, thoughtful soul. The man standing before her looked like he had been carved out of the Wyoming granite. Jeremiah was exceptionally tall. his shoulders broad under a worn canvas duster. A gray Stetson was pulled low over his eyes, but she could see the jagged, pale scar that slashed down his jawline, the mark of a violent past he had never mentioned in his correspondence. His eyes were the color of cold river stones. He stepped forward, his boots heavy on the wooden planks. He looked down at Gail, his gaze sweeping over her dark hair, her sensible brown dress, and the distinct lack of a delicate porcelain demeanor. "You're the Miller girl?" His voice was a low, gravelly rumble that sent a shiver down her spine. Gail swallowed the lump of panic in her throat. "I am." He pulled the ivory cameo from his vest pocket, looking at the blonde painting, and then back at Gail, his brow furrowed in a deep, intimidating scowl. "Portrait you sent looks different, considerably." The artist in Boston charged extra for accuracy. Mr. Caldwell. Gail lied smoothly, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "My sister. My family felt a more idealized image would serve better. And a typhoid fever 2 winters ago robbed me of my lighter hair. If you are disappointed, I can return the money, though I will need time to earn it." It was a bold bluff. She didn't have a dime. Jeremiah studied her for a long, agonizing moment. He didn't look angry, just terribly tired. "I didn't pay for a painting," he finally said, shoving the cameo back into his pocket. "I paid for a partner. Someone who won't break when the first winter blizzard hits. You look like you can survive. That's enough." He took her trunk, tossing it into the back of the wagon as easily as if it were a bag of feathers. "We're going to Judge Higgins' office. We wed today, before we head to the ranch. It ain't proper for a single woman to be under my roof, and I ain't got time for a long courtship." Within the hour, Gail found herself standing in a cramped, whiskey-scented office behind the general store. A sweaty justice of the peace mumbled through the vows. When Gail was asked to state her name, she felt the bile rise in her throat. "Clara Miller," she whispered, the lie burning her tongue. "Speak up, girl," the judge barked. "Clara," she said, louder. She looked up at Jeremiah. He was watching her intently, slipping a plain gold band onto her calloused finger. His hands were rough, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. The guilt almost crushed her right then and there. The ride to the Broken Spur Ranch took 3 hours. The silence between them was thick. When they finally crested a ridge, Jeremiah reined in the horses. Below them lay a sprawling valley, a muddy river cutting through it like a silver ribbon. But the ranch itself was stark. A half-finished log cabin, a sturdy barn, and miles of rough timber fencing. It was not the grand estate Clara had envisioned. It was a battlefield. "It ain't Boston," Jeremiah said, his voice tight. "But the soil is good, and the water rights are mine." He paused, his jaw clenching. "At least, they are, so long as I have a family on this land." Gail looked at him, catching the tension in his words. "What do you mean?" Jeremiah snapped the reins, urging the horses down the slope. "The Homestead Act has stipulations. But more than that, I've got a neighbor, a man named Hiram Cobb. He owns the Double K Ranch to the north. Cobb wants this valley. He's been trying to buy me out, starve me out, and bleed me out for 2 years. The local land office told him this claim reverts to the territory if I ain't married and establishing a permanent household by the end of the month." Gail's eyes widened. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Jeremiah hadn't sent for a bride out of mere loneliness. He had sent for a bride to save his life's work. He was in a war, and she had just married into the front lines. "Cobb is a ruthless man," Jeremiah continued, his eyes scanning the horizon as if expecting an ambush. "He thought I wouldn't find a woman willing to come out to this desolation in time. You being here, it ruins his plan. But it puts a target on your back, Clara." Hearing her sister's name from his lips felt like a knife twist. "I'm not afraid of hard work, Jeremiah, or of Mr. Cobb." He glanced at her, a flicker of genuine surprise breaking through his stoic expression. He nodded slowly. "We'll see." Over the next 3 weeks, Gail proved it. She shed the last remnants of her city life. She woke before dawn, tending to the cast iron stove, baking bread, mending heavy canvas sacks, and learning to shoot a Winchester rifle. She discovered that Jeremiah worked himself to exhaustion every day, trying to build a fence line that Cobb's men kept mysteriously cutting at night. Despite the harshness of their lives, A strange, quiet rhythm developed between them. Jeremiah was a man of few words, but he noticed things. He noticed when she burned her hand on the stove and left a tin of fresh aloe salve by her wash basin. He noticed that she liked the wild lupines that grew by the creek, and one evening, she found a small bundle of them tied with twine on the kitchen table. Gail was falling deeply in love with her husband, but the lie of her identity stood between them like an invisible wall of ice. How could she tell this man, a man who valued loyalty above all else, a man currently fighting thieves and liars, that his own wife was an imposter? The tension broke on a sweltering Tuesday afternoon. Jeremiah was 5 miles away, tracking a stray calf. Gail was in the yard, pinning heavy wet sheets to the line. The heavy thud of approaching hooves made her turn. 3 men rode into the yard. They didn't look like ranch hands. They looked like hired guns. The man in the center rode a massive black gelding. He had a silver-studded saddle and a smile that didn't reach his cold, dead eyes. This was Hiram Cobb. "Well now," Cobb drawled, leaning over his saddle horn and looking Gail up and down with blatant disrespect. Caldwell actually did it. Bought himself a parlor doll to save his dirt. Gail calmly set down her laundry basket. She didn't run into the house. She stood her ground, wiping her wet hands on her apron. "Mr. Caldwell is not here. You are trespassing." Cobb laughed, a dry barking sound. The men flanking him chuckled. "I ain't trespassing, little lady. I'm just surveying my future property." See, a paper marriage to a city girl who'll be running back east before the first snow won't hold up in court. I give you a month before the coyotes or the isolation break your mind. "My mind is perfectly fine, Mr. Cobb," Gail said, her voice dropping to a dangerous calm. Cobb sneered, spurring his horse forward a few steps, forcing Gail to look up at the massive animal. "Tell Caldwell his fence on the North Ridge is coming down tonight, and if he tries to put it back up, he won't be coming home to his pretty new wife." Cobb reached down, intending to mockingly tip her bonnet. Before his leather-gloved hand could get within an inch of her face, Gail moved. She didn't scream or flinch. She reached into the deep pocket of her heavy apron, pulled out the Colt revolver Jeremiah had taught her to load, cocked the hammer, and pressed the cold iron barrel directly against the nose of Cobb's prized black horse. The animal whinnied and stepped back. Cobb froze, his mocking smile vanishing instantly. The 2 hired guns reached for their holsters, but stopped when they saw the dead-eyed certainty in Gail's gaze. "If you touch me, your horse dies first," Gail said, her voice ringing out clear and hard across the empty yard. "Then, I'll shoot you in the knee. I am a terrible shot, Mr. Cobb, but at this distance, I doubt I'll miss. Get off my land." For a long, breathless moment, nobody moved. The Wyoming wind howled around them, snapping the wet sheets on the line. Cobb stared at the fierce, dark-haired woman holding the gun. He realized, with a sinking feeling, that Caldwell hadn't imported a fragile city girl. He had brought out a fighter. Cobb slowly raised his hands in mock surrender, yanking his horse's reins back. "All right, Mrs. Caldwell. Have it your way. But this ain't over." He wheeled his horse around and spurred it into a gallop, his men following close behind. Gail stood perfectly still until the dust from their horses settled. Then, her knees buckled. She dropped the gun into the dirt and fell against the wooden post of the clothesline, gasping for air, her whole body shaking violently. "I told you to aim for center mass, not the horse." Gail gasped and spun around. Jeremiah was standing at the corner of the cabin, his Winchester rifle resting easily in the crook of his arm. He had been there the whole time. He walked toward her, his eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. He stooped down, picked up the Colt, and blew the dust off it. He looked at Gail, really looked at her, seeing past the plain dress and the dirt on her cheek. "You aren't Clara, are you?" he asked, quietly. Gail's heart stopped. The wind seemed to die away. The moment of truth had finally come. The Wyoming wind seemed to stop dead, leaving only the heavy silence of the yard. Gail stared at the Winchester resting in Jeremiah's arm, and then at the rusted Colt revolver he had just picked up from the dirt. The lie she had carried for 2,000 miles finally shattered into a million jagged pieces. "No," Gail whispered, her voice trembling but her chin raised high. "I am not Clara. My name is Gail. Clara is my younger sister." Jeremiah's face became a mask of stone. He didn't shout. He didn't raise his weapon. But the sudden, icy distance in his eyes was far more terrifying than Hiram Cobb's threats. "Explain," he said, his voice a flat, dead calm. Standing there in the fading afternoon light, Gail stripped away every falsehood. She told him about their father's crushing debts in Boston, the looming threat of the poorhouse, and Clara's desperate bid for a wealthy savior. She spared herself no grace, detailing how Clara had taken his $400 and eloped with a traveling salesman in the dead of night. "If I had stayed, they would have thrown me in a debtor's prison for her theft," Gail confessed, tears finally spilling over her lashes, cutting tracks through the dust on her cheeks. "I had the train ticket. I knew you needed a wife to secure your claim. I didn't come to steal from you, Jeremiah. I came to work off the debt. I came to be a partner, but I understand if you send me away." Jeremiah looked out toward the horizon where Cobb and his men had vanished. The muscle in his jaw feathered. The betrayal was a bitter pill, another disappointment in a life that seemed built on them. But he was a pragmatist above all else. He looked back at the woman who had just held a gun to a cattle baron's horse to defend a patch of dirt she didn't even own. "Sending you away means losing the broken spur," Jeremiah said slowly, the gravel in his voice scraping against the silence. "Cobb knows we're married on paper. If you leave, the territory invalidates my homestead claim. The land office in Cheyenne is already looking for an excuse to hand this valley over to the cattle conglomerates." He turned his back to her, looking toward the half-finished cabin. "You owe me $400, Gail. You can start paying it off by peeling the potatoes for supper. The lie stays between us. As far as Wyoming is concerned, you are my wife." The following months were a masterclass in emotional endurance. The physical labor of the ranch was brutal, but the agonizing distance between them was worse. They shared meals in silence. They slept in the same small cabin, separated by a heavy quilt hung from the rafters. Yet, in the quiet moments, a fierce, unspoken respect began to take root. Jeremiah saw how Gail never complained when her hands bled from mending barbed wire. Gail saw how Jeremiah would quietly leave the largest portion of venison stew on her plate, or how he spent his evenings whittling a proper wooden handle for her sewing shears so they wouldn't blister her fingers. As October bled into a bitter, freezing November, a twist of fate arrived in the saddlebags of the Pony Express rider, passing through Bitter Creek. It was a letter, forwarded from Boston, bearing Gail's real name. Gail opened it by the hearth while Jeremiah was out chopping firewood. The elegant, looping script belonged to Clara. The salesman had abandoned her in St. Louis, taking the last of the stolen money. Clara was destitute, furious, and had somehow learned through the Boston grapevine that Gail had taken the train west in her stead. The letter was venomous. Clara demanded that Gail send her $500 immediately. "If you do not wire the funds to the St. Louis bank by Christmas," Clara wrote, "I will write to the Wyoming Territorial Land Office. I will tell them of your fraud. I will tell them that Jeremiah Caldwell's marriage is a sham and his claim is forfeit. Pay me, sister, or lose your dirt." Gail stared at the parchment, the blood roaring in her ears. Her sister, the golden child, was willing to destroy everything Gail had bled for, just to save herself. Gail looked around the rough-hewn cabin. She smelled the wood smoke, the dried sage, the worn leather of Jeremiah's boots by the door. This wasn't just dirt. It was her home. When Jeremiah walked in, shaking snow from his duster, he saw Gail staring into the flames of the hearth. "Bad news from the east?" he asked, noticing the crumpled envelope on the floor. Gail didn't hesitate. She didn't hide the truth this time. She stood up, walked over to the roaring fire, and tossed Clara's letter directly into the flames. She watched the paper curl, blacken, and turn to ash. "No," Gail said, turning to look her husband directly in the eyes. "Just ghosts, and they have no place in Wyoming." Winter hit the Bighorn Basin like a swinging hammer. By late December, the snowdrifts were chest high, and the temperature plummeted to 30 below zero. The isolation was absolute. It was the perfect time for a man like Hiram Cobb to strike. Cobb knew that the law didn't ride out this far in the dead of winter. It happened on the eve of the new year. Gail awoke to a terrifying, crackling roar and the panicked screaming of horses. She sat up, the freezing air biting her skin. The window glowed with an unnatural, hellish orange light. "Jeremiah!" she screamed. He was already out of bed, pulling on his boots and grabbing his Winchester. "The barn!" he shouted. "Cobb's men!" Gail didn't freeze. She threw on her heavy wool coat over her nightgown, shoved her feet into her boots, and grabbed the Colt revolver and a bandolier of ammunition. When she burst through the cabin door, the heat of the inferno hit her like a physical blow. The roof of the barn was entirely engulfed in flames. Jeremiah was sprinting across the snow, ignoring the heat, trying to unlatch the heavy wooden doors to save their draft horses. From the dark tree line beyond the corral, the sharp crack of rifle fire echoed. A bullet splintered the doorframe inches from Jeremiah's head. Cobb's men weren't just burning them out. They were shooting to kill. "Get down!" Gail shrieked. She threw herself behind the frozen water trough, raised the Colt, and fired 3 blind shots into the trees. She knew she couldn't hit them, but the muzzle flashes forced the snipers to duck, giving Jeremiah the precious seconds he needed. He ripped the barn doors open. The terrified horses bolted out into the snow, safe from the flames. But as Jeremiah turned to run back to the cabin, a second volley of gunfire erupted. Jeremiah stumbled, a sickening grunt escaping his lips. He fell hard into the snow, clutching his upper thigh. Dark blood immediately began to pool, stark and terrifying against the white ground. "Jeremiah!" Gail didn't think about the bullets. She abandoned her cover and ran out into the open yard. She grabbed him by the collar of his coat, her boots slipping in the bloody snow, and dragged his heavy frame behind the thick oak chopping block. "Leave me," Jeremiah gritted out, his face pale with agony. "Get on one of the horses. Ride into the dark." "Shut up!" Gail snarled, tears freezing on her cheeks. She ripped a strip of fabric from her nightgown and tied a brutal tourniquet around his leg, pulling it so tight he almost blacked out. She picked up his dropped Winchester, levered around into the chamber, and rested the barrel on the chopping block. For 3 hours, the standoff continued. The burning barn provided enough light to see anyone approaching the cabin. Gail shot at every shadow that moved, her shoulder bruising black and blue from the rifle's kick. She was a seamstress from Boston, but the Wyoming frontier had forged her into something entirely unyielding. By dawn, the fire had burned itself out, and Cobb's men, shivering and out of ammunition, realized the Caldwells were not going to die quietly. They retreated into the timber. Gail didn't wait. She managed to haul Jeremiah into the cabin, stoking the fire and packing his wound with snow to slow the bleeding. Then, she caught one of the loose draft horses, hoisted herself bareback onto the animal, and rode 10 miles through knee-deep snow to the neighboring outpost. Fate, it seemed, finally smiled on the broken spur. Huddled around the stove in the outpost general store was none other than U.S. Deputy Marshal Frank Canton, a legendary lawman known for his ruthless pursuit of cattle rustlers in the Johnson County conflicts. Gail, half frozen, her face smeared with soot and blood, burst through the doors. She didn't ask for help. She demanded it. She laid out Cobb's crimes, the arson, and the attempted murder. Marshal Canton, taking one look at the ferocious, desperate woman before him, immediately deputized 3 local men and rode back with her. They found Jeremiah slipping in and out of consciousness, but alive. Canton and his posse tracked Cobb's men through the fresh snow, catching them at a line shack 2 miles north. The men, freezing and demoralized, surrendered and confessed that Cobb had paid them $50 each to burn the Caldwells out. 2 days later, Marshal Canton rode up to the Double K Ranch and arrested Hiram Cobb in his own parlor. Without their wealthy backer, the threats against the broken spur dissolved like snow in the spring sun. A week later, the cabin was quiet again. The wound in Jeremiah's leg was healing, though it would leave him with a permanent limp. He was sitting in the rocking chair by the fire, watching Gail patch a burn hole in his heavy canvas coat. Marshal Canton said, "We have grounds to seize a portion of Cobb's herd as restitution for the barn," Jeremiah said quietly. Gail bit off the end of her thread, smoothing the fabric over her knee. "That will help us rebuild before planting season." Jeremiah leaned forward, the firelight catching the gray in his eyes. The hardened, defensive walls he had built around himself had completely crumbled. "Gail," he said, using her real name. The sound of it on his lips made her breath hitch. She looked up. "The debt is paid," Jeremiah said, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before. "It was paid the moment you dragged me out of the snow, but I need to know something. When Clara's letter came, when you burned it, you chose this place. Did you choose me?" Gail slowly set the mending basket aside. She walked over to him, kneeling beside his chair so they were eye to eye. She reached out, her calloused fingers gently tracing the jagged scar along his jawline. "I didn't choose the dirt, Jeremiah," she whispered, her eyes shining with absolute certainty. "I chose the man who fought for it. I am exactly where I belong." He reached out, pulling her into his arms, burying his face in her dark hair. The marriage contract gathering dust in the Cheyenne land office still bore the name Clara Miller, but the woman holding Jeremiah Caldwell, the woman who had saved his life, his ranch, and his frozen heart, was Gail. And in the wild, untamed expanse of the West, the truth of their love was the only law that mattered. If you loved this story of frontier justice, survival, and a love forged in the unforgiving fires of the Wild West, hit that like button right now. It really helps the channel grow. Want more incredible true-to-life historical dramas and wild stories of the frontier? Make sure to subscribe and tap the notification bell so you never miss a tale. Share this video with a friend who loves a good Western plot twist. And drop a comment below. Would you have the courage to take your sister's place? Let me know.